Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Uh, Boy, as I look at it, the last time we did this, the sun was a little lower in the sky. It's getting a little higher and higher, and before you know it, it's going to be June 21st, and the days will start getting shorter again. But the good news is that the return to the fields has gone very well so far. We did Atlanta, and then we did Shiloh, and both went extremely well. Everybody showing up had their COVID shots, and with the releases of some of the restrictions and so forth, as much as is possible to do some of these tours normally, we're back into the business of doing tours. We've got three of them set in June. We've got Saratoga is going to take place at the end of next week with Scott Patchen. And then 2 weeks after that, we're doing Custer to the Little Bighorn and a loop back, and that one's full and sold out. And we're doing Straits Raid with Brian Wills and Norm Dazinger towards the end of the month over a weekend, and that's got 13 people registered so far. And then when we go on into July, our first July program's got 33 people registered with Scott Hartwig, and the retreat from Gettysburg is registered 10 so far and moving on. So looks like we're going to get back to the field. And this evening, ironically, we are going the full circle. If we're saying that COVID has had a huge impact on us, and it has, like it is with all of us, then tonight is the circle completed, because back in March of 2020, the very first program affected was the program that Wade was going to lead on to the bitter end on the Civil War in North Carolina in 1865. And of course, we had to cancel that program. And little did we know that we wouldn't return to the field again for 13 months. So it's with a great deal of pleasure realizing that we rescheduled the program for October of this year, and that we have got the same cohort of about 7 or 8 have carried over to this program, and we're open for registration for this. And it's basically going to cover from Sherman just crossing over into North Carolina through the Battle of Monroe's Crossroads, Averysboro, Bentonville, and all the way through the surrender negotiations and so forth. So a really fine program, and Wade Sokoloky is the gentleman who is the go-to guy for Eastern North Carolina now, and his books cover the campaign that he's going to be presented. And when you put him together with Chris Bonville and Mark Bradley, you have got a really strong cohort of historians for the Tar Heel State that you're going to enjoy. So this evening we have the pleasure of having Wade along to do that. Now we have also evolved a little bit. This is our 18th or 19th interview in this series that started back the first week after New Year's Day, and this has proven so popular that we're going to continue doing it, and we're going to carry on over into we're going to carry it into the 2022 and bring some other folks together. I've got Gordon Ray is going to talk about his new book, and I think Kent Masterson Brown's going to do his. I wouldn't be surprised if we get Wade to come in and talk about his. But you can see on the screen here all these various and sundry things that you can watch for free on the BGS YouTube channel. And I send out notifications that from time to time, but just go and you can join the other 173 subscribers if you're not already subscribed, and you can watch all of them and just look at the different topics and so forth there. I mean, it's just really is excellent. And when you combine that with the new membership benefit that we have, which is the video archives of Blue and Gray, which are about 350 of our lectures from the very start of Blue and Gray. you find that you've just got a really a big opportunity to pick up a lot of first-class information from the best historians around. So we're very proud of all this, and as we start beefing back up again with what we're doing, I think you can find that that you'll get all sorts of neat things. Some of you have noted that when we carried over registration forms that we haven't updated those yet, we're going to as soon as we possibly can. And those that are open for registration, of course, you can go ahead and register. But take a look. I'm sure after we get done tonight, there will be a whole new interest in Wade's program in October, and I hope many of you will help populate the cohort for that event. Just before we get into this, before I introduce Wade, I will point out that this program is being hosted by Karen Needles with the Lincoln Archives Project. If you haven't visited Lincoln Archives, here's a look-see at it right now. It's a completely free site. Karen has been working on this for more than 20 years, and while her intention of digitizing more than 11 million records is probably on a schedule to complete somewhere in 24-25, she has a lot of stuff online, a lot of very interesting stuff with newspapers and some of the things such as the Dakota Indian Wars, all the trial records, the records of the trial of the Lincoln assassination and so forth. So it's just really a neat place to go. The other thing that I would recommend to you and ask you to consider, Karen is not a nonprofit organization. She is not saw fit to invest the time and red tape necessary to get a 501c3, and the site is completely free. But should you be there and like what you see and want to support what she's doing, she has to pay bills like the rest of us, and she'll be grateful for your contributions to support the organization. So with that, I think we're good to go. And hey, good evening, Wade. Good to see you again.
Oh, thanks, Lee. I'm glad to be on board here. Thanks for all the help, and thanks for the invite.
Well, it's really exciting to chat again. We haven't known each other a real long time, about 3 years or so, and you've always had, well, almost immediately after our first program, you got involved with the hurricane that damaged your home and stuff, and so you've had an exciting 3 years or so. But I'm delighted to have the opportunity to get together with you, and I'm really appreciative of Steve Wise for having introduced us. When I saw you in the presentation you made at New Bern and Weese's Forks and so forth, I knew that we needed to work again, and I'm delighted that we're going to do so in October. To get started, how about telling us about yourself and your fascination with the Civil War and in particular Sherman in North Carolina?
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. I was born and raised here in eastern North Carolina, the town of Beaufort, the other Beaufort, not Beaufort, South Carolina, but we call it Beaufort, North Carolina here in the northern state. Growing up here in coastal North Carolina, I'm right in the heart of Ambrose Burnside's 1862 campaign here in eastern North Carolina. My mother had an ancestor that was captured at Fort Macon, Confederate artilleryman during that time. So there's always been a little bit of history, a fascination with history growing up here where I am here in North Carolina. But I'll tell you, it really took off when I finally made my way into the Army after I graduated East Carolina. I went into the Army and I was at Officer Basic Course, and I had my very first staff ride. And I thought that was so cool. That was the neatest thing, because we got to go to Gettysburg and we were forced to read about the Civil War. And that just really kind of put a little bit of fuel on the fire. And then my first assignment out at Fort Campbell in the 101st, one of the lieutenants in the battalion with me, Mikey Hare, he's from Illinois. So you you guess what side he's on. And oh, by the way, he had a ancestor in Uncle Billy's army. So all I heard for several years at Fort Campbell as we tramped to Fort Donelson and Murfreesboro and some of the other battlefields in the area there was all about Uncle Billy. And it kind of really got me interested to learn more about Uncle Billy so I could argue with Mike a little bit better. But as my career went on, I finally got stationed at Fort Bragg, and there's this one afternoon in 1997, I'm standing in line there to check out, where all the candy and the bubble gum is that drives parents crazy with kids in the shopping cart. There happened to be a big, tall stack of books there. I said, what is this book? It was Last Stand in the Carolinas, the Battle of Bentonville, Mark Bradley. And I purchased it. And it kind of like, wow, Aversboro's right down the road from here. Fayetteville Arsenal, Bentonville, Monroe's Crossroads, right here in my backyard at Fort Bragg. So it really, from that point on in 97, it took off. When I'm at Command and General Staff College out at Leavenworth, I studied under Dr. Glenn Robinson from Chickamauga fame, who's really a super mentor. And, of all his students, I don't know if you know about Glenn, but most of Glenn's students will do their thesis on some aspect of the Chickamauga campaign. Well,
sure.
Wade's the lonely one that says, no, I'm going to do it on Sherman's logistics in the Carolinas campaign. And the good thing is Glenn's a North Carolina boy to begin with. So he kind of gave me a green pass on that one. But I really, growing up here in Eastern North Carolina and my experiences in the Army, as part of my professional development as an officer, obviously studying military art, science, really fueled that passion.
That's cool. You've written 2 books, and I think you have another one in the making. Tell us about how important they are in establishing the background for this field study we're going to do in October.
Okay, great. Yeah, and part of that thesis that I did on Sherman, it kind of grew in, knowing Dr. Glenn Robinson, and then I met Eric Wittenberg along the way, who wound up at the time was publishing Ironclad. He owned Ironclad Publishing. Became very good friends, another good mentor. He first published No Such Army Since the Days of Julius Caesar. When I was at Bragg and I got interested in Aversboro, Mark Smith, the co-author there, he was a fellow major as well, interested, and we're both on active duty doing things like Afghanistan, a few other places, Korea, and ultimately it became why don't we collaborate, work together on this, and we've become quite a good team, I think. And our first book came out in 2005, was No Such Army Since the Days of Julius Caesar, and it covered the aspect of Fayetteville and Aversboro. When I mentioned Dr. Bradley's book, Last Stand in the Carolinas, and also the late Nathaniel Hughes, he had a great book on the Battle of Bentonville as well. Whether it's Bradley or Hughes, when you read those books on Bentonville, they're introducing these small battles that lead up to Bentonville as part of the process to introduce essentially the orders of battle. Okay. When you look at either Hughes or Bradley, they will commit a few pages to Aversboro. So what Mark and I tried to do was, and a little bit of mentoring from Eric, was get more definitive study itself of the battle. And ultimately, it kind of bookends with either Bradley or Hughes' book. If you're studying the run up to Bentonville, obviously you want to learn all you can about Aversboro, and it winds up being the perfect one. If we fast forward to when the book was finally published there in 2005, it happened to be Eric had his roundtable down from Columbus, and Mark Bradley was out there, and Mark and the other Mark and myself were out at Monroe's Crossroads. And while Eric is up front doing the cavalry talk, I'm standing in the back with Mark Bradley. And Dr. Bradley's like, all right, Wade, what you going to do next? I'm like, I'm chuckling. I'm like, Mark, I just got done with Aversboro. He goes, no, what? He's serious. What are you going to do next? And I said, I never really thought about it. He goes, you need to focus on the other part of Sherman's army that's not coming north of him, Savannah. You need to focus on Wise's Fork and your logistics piece. And because it's all in Sherman's own words, to prepare for my coming is what's happening with Cox and Schofield and Terry coming up from Wilmington and Moorhead and stuff. And with a little bit of kicking in the butt by Dr. Bradley, here we go, 7 or 8 years later, ultimately, Mark and I's second book comes out, which covers the Battle of Wise's Forks. Now,
that's pretty neat. And of course, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say that, the whole body of literature that has come out of North Carolina in this period, when you add in Eric's book on Monroe's Crossroads, and you bring in Mark Bradley's book, if you could find it, and Chris Fonville's book on Wilmington, it really is a powerhouse collection of very, very easily read scholarship that helps people get a good sense as to Sherman's march through the Carolinas and all that was necessary to support him. It's a very, very impressive advancement of scholarship for a section of the country that, until those books started coming out about 25 years ago, there wasn't a hell of a lot written about it. So it's a lot. It's very impressive.
It is. And, in the Battle of Wise's Fork, it's almost, the nickname is the forgotten battle here in North Carolina, but arguably, depending on who beer math you want to follow when it comes to tables of organization and stuff, the number of troops, Wise's Fork is arguably the second largest land battle fought here in North Carolina, second to Bentonville. So it does present a interesting case. And I will add, you mentioned Chris Fonville and a few others, but also Hartley Chris Hartley out in the West. His book on Stoneman's raid.
I
very
did
important. So
that book.
You're spot on, Lynn. When it comes to the 1865 aspect, we're making some good progress here in North Carolina.
Very impressive. Sherman's activities from October of 1864, after the fall of Atlanta, to and through the Carolinas, has seemed to receive attention that I think is probably out of balance with the relative importance of the movements. Tell us about Sherman's goals in the March to the Sea and juxtapose it against Sherman's march through the Carolinas.
Yeah, when we look at the 1865 campaign and you look at those similarities or differences between the two, you probably ought to begin with Sherman. After Sherman basically says the Carolinas, the March to the Sea was child's play compared to the Carolinas campaign, and he's true, because from the difficulties of the weather, the terrain, the low country of South Carolina, freezing water, rain swollen Great Petey River, the Edisto, the Catawba, all the challenges that pontoon engineers are having, it was much more difficult than the March to the Sea. And oh, by the way, when we get into the North Carolina aspect, there's a lot more lead flying around in the air than what Griswoldville or even Buckhead Church between the cavalry elements on the way to Savannah. But when we look at the campaign itself, the similarities between that and the March to the Sea is obviously the impact on the civilian population. Okay, demonstrating to the Southern population that this war is lost. There's nothing you can do. There's no one stopping the enemy force moving through your country. That kind of thing. Obviously, those similarities are there. When you look at the two, in both cases, Sherman is moving to his next logistics base, his supply base. If you look at the map there from Atlanta to Savannah, Sherman's, it's really a shifting of base. His logistics base is right west of Fort McAllister along US Highway 17. If you ever venture down there, there's a boat ramp right over the Geechee River there. Once Fort McAllister fell, Montgomery Meigs had pre-positioned a lot of supplies offshore, and that's where the base was to resupply before they continue against Savannah. The same thing will happen in North Carolina as he moves north from Savannah. He's moving towards Goldsboro. He put his finger on the map before he ever left Savannah, and he told his chief quartermaster, Langdon Easton, and Amos Beckworth, his commissary, and W.W. Wright, his brilliant civilian railroad engineer, "You're not going with me. Get on a boat at Hilton Head. going up to Morehead City and get that railroad going, because supplies I want to be waiting on me when I arrive in Goldsboro mid-March. It's nothing but an intermediate objective, because when all this is being planned in Sherman's mind, he's heading to Virginia. Now, we know with hindsight, things change a little bit different. He heads left towards Raleigh and Durham after Goldsboro. But in both instances, he's moving to a supply base. Both campaigns, his armies depend on foraging. That's where their daily supplies come from. There's very limited days of supply of meat and rations, hardtack bread. Probably the largest day of supply per soldier is roughly 30 days of coffee. Back then, they loved their coffee in the morning, just like we love our coffee today. It's no different with soldiers today versus back then. So it's an army that's on the move, and it depends on foraging because it's shifting its base. There is no railroad. There is no line of communication back to Chattanooga or back to Savannah that's supplying these armies. It's going to have to come off the ground. The other similarity is the wing formation. I believe Sherman first used it during the Meridian campaign, but for sure he used it on the way to Atlanta. Why is he using the wing formation? Well, obviously command and control is kind of put hard to control 60,000 men. So O.O. Howard is going to have the right wing and Henry Slocum is going to have the left wing. But think in terms of this is a foraging army. They're not moving north from Savannah up I-95, all 60,000 men going down one road. They're moving across multiple routes, which facilitates foraging. It facilitates quick maneuver. And so it's a need for command and control. Just like on the march to the sea, Sherman will destroy whatever he deems that will facilitate sustaining the Confederate war effort, whether it's an arsenal like Fayetteville, the railroads, mills, etc. Those kind of things are prime target for his army when it's moving through.
And after crossing South Carolina, which I've done with Steve Wise on many an occasion, and it really is a tremendous challenge to move the force across South Carolina. Sherman pulls up around Cheraw and prepares to enter North Carolina, focusing on that, having completed his march from Savannah up towards Cheraw. What's the status of his force? What's his condition by the time it gets to Cheraw, and what are going to be his biggest challenges, and how does he address them when he goes into North Carolina?
Lynn, let me just backtrack real quick here. I want to cover a few more things on comparing the two, because everything I've talked about this time is similarities. Now let me talk about a few differences real quick. And if you look at those blue stars on the map, I think a big difference between the March to the Sea and the Carolinas campaign, Sherman uses a lot of feints to deceive, to keep the Confederate forces off balance. Is he going to Augusta or is he going to Charleston? Ultimately, he's going to Columbia, and the same thing as he moves north. He's ultimately heading to Fayetteville, but when he come out of Columbia, is he going to Charlotte? Charlotte is an option because the railroad back up towards Greensboro, ultimately to the back door, Danville, Virginia. It's a crazy course of action, but it's something he could do. And even when he gets to North Carolina, the Confederates are still, the sandbox is narrowed, but when he's at Fayetteville, is he going to Raleigh or Goldsboro? So what's important is Sherman is keeping the Confederate forces off balance with a series of feints and stuff. Another big thing is Ebenezer Creek. Ebenezer Creek before Savannah, that's the situation with the pulling up the pontoon bridge by Jeff Davis, okay? And the African Americans being stuck on the other side of the bank. Well, that's a hard lesson learned by Sherman. And when he gets to North Carolina, the same thing is happening again when he hits Fayetteville. He's got anywhere between 5,000 to 7,000, depending on whose beer match you're following, non-combatants, slaves mainly, hanging onto his army. But this time, he literally details regiments to take those non-combatants and hands them off to the military authorities there. So I think that's really important. And the last thing is the big thing. Here in North Carolina, we call it 2 weeks of fury. 14-day period, gang. 14 days, 4 major battles. Sherman didn't see this in Savannah. As one Union soldier would say, the rebels haven't shown this much pluck since Atlanta. But 4 major battles in less than a 2-week period. And 3 of them are offensive in nature by the Confederates. Only one of them is strictly defense. They're offensive in nature. So that's a big difference between the March to Sea and the Carolinas campaign. All right, addressing what's the status of Sherman's army. When you look at that, first of all, the morale. They're Uncle Billy's boys. They're confident. They're confident in their leader. They go wherever he goes. They truly believe in Sherman. And so that's a powerful when you're a military commander with an army of 60,000 hardened veterans that believes you. Oh man, that makes a big difference. So the other thing is Mother Nature. Mother Nature has played havoc on Sherman's army in South Carolina. Not so much the right wing, but the left wing. Slocum's boys, Jeff Davis, Jackson, Williams, Corps Commander Williams, 24th, the old man. But the left wing of Sherman's army has struggled tremendously, even when the campaign started on 1 February. Part of the left wing of the army is still on the west bank of the Savannah River, on the Georgia side of the river, to include Kilpatrick's cavalry. And Jeff Davis's corps has a hell of a time throughout the campaign, whether it's the Catawba River, the Lynch's River, it's totally flooded. Even when they get to the Great Petey River, and they're trying to get into North Carolina, they're hung up and literally delayed. I mean, Sherman's engineers, the 58th Indiana boys, the pontoon guys for left wing, literally have to build a trestle 200 feet out into the Great PD because they don't have enough boats, not enough canvas. And ultimately, the 20th Corps is sent down to Sherrall to get across with the right wing. So it's been a real big struggle so far when we look at that aspect. But as far as the right wing, it's been a kind of a, I say cakewalk, but that's really loosey-goosey there. But really, the only really difficult piece the right wing of the army has is right when the campaign kicks off down along the Sokolosky, the defensive line there with General McLaws guarding 4 individual bridges there. And it's Joseph Mower's division that will fight on the Battle River Bridge and takes that bridge and obviously turns McLaws out. And then from that point on, the right wing is out of the Low Country. They're moving now northwesterly towards Columbia, and the ground is sloping up and it's getting sandier, and it's a lot more easier sleeping at night now when we look at that perspective as well. Now, when we get to the Carolina piece, this is the map that Craig Swain did. He's got those of you check out his website. He's got a great daily by day movement of Sherman during the 1865 Carolinas campaign. Craig let me borrow his map for this presentation. But over here underneath where you see General Hardee, that's the Great Petey River. And you can see the North Carolina, South Carolina line here. And you can see how Sherman's corps, the right wing, the 15th and the 17th Corps, and then the 14th and the 20th, they're moving on multiple routes. The objective for the right wing is Sherrall or Cheraw, as they say down there under South Carolina every now and then. And then also you have Chesterfield here, South Carolina, with the left wing. The entire time, Sherman's cavalry, Kilpatrick, is hanging on the left flank of the army, kind of like in a screening role. But as you can see, they're really the first ones to enter in here. Now, on the upcoming tour in October, we're going to start the tour, and we're going to begin right down here. We see this yellow star underneath Sherrall. That's the Thompson Creek line. That's where Joseph Mower. We're going to kind of follow Joseph all the way to his final charge at Bentonville. But his boys are the first ones to really break this line and then occupy Sherrall first here. But then we're also going to switch over here to Chesterfield along Thompson's Creek, where the left wing kind of engaged some of the Confederates there. And then we're going to venture up into this little area over here, a little known day-long skirmish called Phillips Crossroads. John G. Barrett mentions it very briefly in Sherman's March. I think Bradley touches on it as well. But it's just another example of the carelessness of Kilpatrick during this campaign. And it's these boys right here, Hampton and Wheeler, that are going to catch him. And I'm going to map it later on, show you a little bit more about that one. But that's the situation right now where I talked about the rain swollen Great PD. This is where Sneedsboro, this is where the 58th Indiana puts that bridge. But it takes so long and delays so long that ultimately everyone 14th and 20th, 14th will move down here and cross here and come over and ultimately meet up here. So that kind of sets the stage, Lynn, on what the Union forces, what's their status of force and some of the biggest challenges they're having.
Okay. Jumping over and looking at what remains of the Confederacy and the Confederate forces, what's your analysis of the Confederates' defensive strategy and their tactics when Sherman operates in North Carolina?
Okay, yeah, real briefly, quickly, when the campaign kicks off on 1 September, it's Beauregard in charge in South Carolina. Johnston's not entered the scene yet. As you can see, the map here depicts, you see some of the various Confederate commanders here. The Army of Tennessee is coming over from Tupelo. Here's D.H. Hill and Augusta, Hardee and Charleston. Beauregard's in charge and Joe Wheeler's cavalry, and Sherman's going to come marching straight up the middle here. The difference here in the initial phase of the campaign, Beauregard is trying to defend a lot of points across the entire state of South Carolina. But as Sherman moves north out of Columbia, and we now know that Charlotte is not as objective because it's turning towards Fayetteville, the box will start to get a lot smaller. Now, by this phase of the operation, Confederate President Jefferson Davis is not having a good month of February in the Carolinas. Well, you go back to January 15th, he lost Fort Fisher. But on February 17th, he lost Columbia. On February 22nd, Schofield occupied Wilmington. So President Davis is under a lot of pressure to do something. By the recommendation of Robert E. Lee, Joe Johnston is brought back into command. And those of you who know the relationship between Johnston and Davis, they're definitely not sending each other Christmas cards every year, and we'll let it go with that. We'll talk more about it on the tour. But Johnston's sandbox, as you can see, compared to the earlier one I showed you about Beauregard, because Sherman's route is becoming more defined. Now, even when he reaches Fayetteville, they're still confused on whether is he going to Raleigh or is he going to Goldsboro. And that's why Johnston puts his finger on the map and says, I'm going to concentrate everybody at Smithfield because it's halfway between Goldsboro and Raleigh on the railroad. So that's his strategy. And what he tells General Hardee on the morning of March 9th, the one and only strategy session they're going to have before they link back up at Bentonville 10 days later, Johnston tells Hardee, because of Bragg and Hoke and Hill success over at Wise's Fort at Kinston, I've sent what's arrived so far from the Army of Tennessee towards them. I'm going to essentially give up Fayetteville. Let Hampton do his rear guard action. I want you to continue north towards Raleigh. Keep close to Sherman. Do not lose the force. Engage if you can, but be careful. It's risky. But oh, by the way, very specific, and it lays out the strategy then very well from Johnston's own words. If Sherman goes to Goldsboro, you'll reinforce Bragg. If Sherman goes to Raleigh, Bragg will move towards you to reinforce. And that is essentially the strategy that we have there as we go in there. And of course, that last strategy that I talked about earlier, that 2 weeks of fury, you will see 4 major battles, 4 weeks. Aversboro is the only one that's purely defensive, and that was an independent operation. Wise's Fork and Bentonville, that was Johnston, which is uncharacteristic. Johnston, he's not a big offensive guy. But here's 2 cases where he's definitely flipping the cards in the deck on Sherman there. He's really assuming the offensive here in a good number of these battles here. Next question.
Sure. In thinking about Sherman and all that he's experienced, what is your assessment of the influence of the meeting Sherman and Grant have with Abraham Lincoln in March and Hampton Roads. Do you believe that this meeting put the brakes on Sherman's plans, or did it merely refine his operation?
Yeah, there's some, Dr. Bradley did his thesis and ultimately became a book called This Outstanding Close. And he covers it very well. And those of you going on the tour, I'd recommend that book, as well as Burt Dunkerley's book on the Surrender Army of Tennessee. And even Eric Wittenberg's got one out there on the Whirlwind. But Sherman goes to Hampton Roads, and in the back of his mind, he's got two things in mind. First, I need Sheridan. And I'm going to talk about that in a later question. Why does he need Sheridan down here in the Carolinas? And the other one is, if Grant can delay operations in Virginia, I'll finish off Johnston down here in the Carolinas, and then I will move north to assist him. Because by this time, Sherman, in his own words, Lee is essentially the center of gravity at this time. You take out Robert E. Lee, and we see it later on after Appomattox. The armies just start disintegrating the rest of the Confederate armies. But he goes to the Hampton Conference. He comes back from it, and he really doesn't get anything he wanted when he went there. He doesn't get Sheridan. Okay, Sheridan is kind of doing this sidebar with Grant. I really don't. Let's take out Lee before the Western boys show up, kind of thing. And oh, by the way, I really don't feel like working for Sherman. And then ultimately, Grant does not wait. By the time even Sherman gets back down into North Carolina, what happens on April 7th, Appomattox is over with. So really, I don't think it really got anything out of it that he really went there for.
Sure. You talk about the 2 weeks of terror of the military encounters in North Carolina. Did any specific ones cause Sherman undue concern? And if so, how so?
Yeah, it kind of centers on, I'm going to focus one on Confederate Kilpatrick and then Johnston. Battle of Monroe's Crossroads, the famous skirt tail skedaddle, all kinds of names for it. Obviously, that rings a bell with most people, but it is definitely a wake-up call. And let me tell you, Judson Kilpatrick, who is Sherman, hell of a damn fool, as how Sherman describes him, just the right guy I need for my cavalry. But unfortunately, he's not the right guy you need during the Carolinas campaign, because now your mounted leader is coming up against some of the best in the South. Wade Hampton, Joe Wheeler, Matthew Colbreth Butler, Dibble, and a whole host of Army of Tennessee cavalry brigade commanders and division commanders. And, in Monroe's Crossroads, it's a concern because, at the very beginning of the campaign, he's ambushed in the town of Aiken, which is one of the few mounted urban fights on horseback during the Civil War. Matter of fact, 2 will occur in this campaign. The first one's at Aiken. He's surprised there. And then he's surprised at another battle we'll show you here, Monroe's Crossroads. And then at Aversboro, Sherman's frustrated with his cavalry because, he wants to keep the army moving. He's only a couple days from Goldsboro, but, find me a way around Hardee, and then ultimately Bentonville is the total failure. The morning of March 19th, the bummers are coming back in and saying the Southerners they don't drive worth a damn. But according to my cavalry chief, in the eyes and ears of my army, Kilpatrick says Johnston is falling back towards Raleigh. And we know what happens a couple hours later on March 19th. Jeff Davis's 14th Corps walks right into a trap. That other little known fight is Phillips Crossroads that I pointed out earlier on the map. Here's another example, Lynn, of the brigades being scattered. You don't even see the 4th Brigade of Kilpatrick. And over here at White Store is Wade Hampton, who's concentrating his cavalry. And this turns out to be an all-day cavalry affair here. And we're going to visit this spot here. But this is the run-up to Monroe's Crossroads. A few days later, he's surprised again. So that is obviously a concern for Sherman in this part, that when we talk about encounters and stuff. And that's why he's wanting Phil Sheridan. If the fight is going to continue in North Carolina, I need Phil Sheridan, because right now Kilpatrick is way outmatched. The other piece is Joe Johnston. Now, he finds out that Johnston has been put back in charge by reading a newspaper. Now, folks, Sherman is not scared of Johnston. He understands his old antagonist from the Atlanta campaign. So he has a little bit more respect for him. He has to be very careful. When I'm crossing the PD or the Cape Fear, I don't put one corps out there for a couple of days by its lonesome, and Johnston can concentrate and pounce on it. So you see this modification when Sherman moves out of Fayetteville. He puts his corps in what he calls light marching order. He strips them of all the wagons and all that's left is ambulances and ammunition. And there's a division pulled out of every corps, like General Geary. He's guarding a wagon train 15, 20 miles away from the rest of his wing. But Sherman does that so his corps are in light order. So just in case something does happen out there with Johnston, his army will be able to move very swiftly. And we see that demonstrated. I mean, Geary's division is a perfect example, gang. He gets the word to drop what you're doing and move towards Bentonville on March 19th. And those boys make over 15, 20 miles through the night. And by 6 o'clock in the morning of March 20th, they're boiling their coffee by the Harper House at Bentonville. So that's by putting your forces in light march will enable them to do that. Next question, Lynn.
You mentioned Chris Hartley's book about Stoneman's raid, and does Stoneman's belated execution of his raid into western and central North Carolina and south central Virginia have any impact on Sherman, or for that matter, Lee's planning?
Yeah. If you look at the memoirs, at both Sherman and Grant's memoirs, and now, of course, it's written in hindsight, Sherman says, Stoneman's raid helped bring an end to the Confederacy. Grant takes a different slant on it, basically saying, well, first of all, it's kind of late in the game. And oh, by the way, you destroyed a lot of great stuff there, food, uniforms, blankets, etc., which really would have facilitated post-conflict reconstruction, transition back to civilian life. So both Sherman and Grant have a different perspective on it. But looking at it from a military perspective, let's just, you got to assume that the war's not over. So beginning the raid, he doesn't start the raid into North Carolina until March 22nd, which is the day after Bentonville. So essentially, the fight is all out of Johnston. But remember, Johnston moves towards Smithfield. Goldsboro is Sherman's objective. There's 2 days distance marching there between the both armies. So really, Johnston just lost the battle, but he still has an army in the field. So by Stoneman's raid in the West and the Piedmont, if we look at it, he knows he outnumbers. He knows he has a veteran army, but he's this Civil War trails map here. You'll see some of the areas in the Piedmont that really Lincolnton, Salisbury, Statesville, Salem. High Point's not on here, but they did hit High Point. I love the story from Nurse Kate Sperry. Stoneman's boys destroy a lot of rations, medical supplies. I mentioned all kinds of classes of supply, and it's when at High Point, Nurse Sperry talks about how the train just arrived with Raleigh with 3 box cars full of medical supplies, and Stoneman's raiders came and burned it all. So there is an impact. If it would have continued, obviously Johnston's army would have had a much more difficult time trying to sustain itself, because Salisbury was really a hard hit as a potential as a supply base for sustaining further Confederate operations, because everything had pretty much transitioned to that Piedmont region of the state once Sherman took Goldsboro and Raleigh. So there is an impact, but I think necessarily it's too late in the game. Ultimately, with hindsight in mind, it was just too late. And of course, Grant was upset for Stoneman because he was late getting started to begin with, which had to do with a little case of hemorrhoids, which I guess it's okay if you're an infantryman, you have hemorrhoids. Dang, I couldn't imagine riding a horse for 12 hours a day and have hemorrhoids. So I'll let it go at that one. But I think that answers that question, Lynn.
Thanks. Sherman was roundly criticized for negotiating with General Johnston and dealing with the issue of peace. Wade, we're both military men, and I want to know what you think of the story of Sherman and his dealings with the War Department and the historic records from that encounter.
Yeah, it's if I use my own experience, as CJ4 in Afghanistan, I remember a couple of times with the boss. I was invited to a few high-level meetings, and it was nice to sit in the room. I never sat at the table. I was kind of like a couple rows back from the boss. But when the ambassadors in there and the State Department, and like, for example, Miss Michelle Fournier from Secretary of Defense's office, though that whole aspect is more than just the military. Sherman really could have used that counsel. Okay. And he gets a little bit in trouble. But I use one more example when I'm teaching out at Leavenworth. When we did our high level plans and orders, division corps level, there was always that one part that dealt with post-conflict. We always said to be published. Nobody wanted to talk about it because it's messy, it's ugly, it's nasty, right? Okay. And plus we're military guys. So, so it was that's my experience from the Army. And hopefully we're doing a lot better at Leavenworth and teaching that aspect of it. But from, clearly, Lynn, Sherman overstepped his boundaries. If he would have just copied Lee and Grant's memorandum from Appomattox word for word, he would have come out smelling like a rose. But he delved into some other areas, and it seemed simple and innocent to him. But, I'm not a lawyer. But a lawyer can look at wording, a lawyer can look at things, and all of a sudden, and of course, Stanton hits the roof, okay? Secretary of War Stanton, once it ultimately gets back there, and Grant picked up on it immediately, okay? Sherman's a great war fighter, but when it comes to this aspect, and he really got in a little bit of trouble. A lot of bad hot water with Stanton, of course. A lot of bad grief between them two and Halleck as well. Hats off to Grant and how he handled it. He came back down here very, very subtly showed up here in North Carolina, handed a message to Grant and to Sherman and talked it out and then kind of stepped back and let Sherman go back. And what's interesting, when Sherman went back the next time, who's with him? Major General John and Schofield, who happens to be a little bit more attuned to the political landscape in the future than what Sherman was. So obviously, he was outside his boundaries. I mean, clearly in that piece. But don't you love that photo here? This painting here. When we go to the Bennett place, I love this and in this one. So I love this painting. It really shows the animosity. And Hampton really, we don't talk about this a lot, but Hampton really did not want to surrender. He was ready to carry on. He was not Johnston's camp when it came to this. So I think that one answers that question.
Wade, tell me, you're a military guy. What, if anything, about the discipline and leadership of Sherman impressed you or concerned you during this operation?
Well, his leadership style, for one thing. He rotated between wings and corps almost daily. So his presence as a commander looks like a private on a horse going by, dirty, muddy, etc. He just exudes leadership, and his presence there at the worst possible times, whether it's the Catawba River with the 14th Corps having a hard time, and he's there at Chesterfield Courthouse, and then obviously at Averysboro as well. So his presence as a senior leader is obviously good. Campaign planning, honestly, when I'm fortunate enough to have the Commanding General Staff College from the Marine Corps a couple times a year. They love Sherman's 1865 campaign because it touches on all levels of war: tactical, operational, and strategic. And that's why they love it with Sherman. He's not the best tactical commander at times. We've got some great examples out there. Kennesaw Mountain's one that comes to mind, and obviously a few other places. But when it comes to linking the operational level of war and the strategic objectives, when it comes to campaign planning, he's perfect. I admire him for that. He has that wisdom piece about him. if I had to, in a perfect example, after Fort Fisher's fall, Grant and Schofield will come down south and have a conversation with General Terry and Porter about the next phase of catching Wilmington. Grant and Schofield are expecting to use Wilmington as the primary port of entry to get supplies to Sherman at Goldsboro. Well, that's a risky assumption because, one, Robert Hoke still holds Wilmington. And oh, by the way, when you take it on February 22nd, Robert Hoke does a dang good job of making sure there's nothing working, functional, or a railroad bridge or Northeast Cape Fear River. And ultimately, it shifts back up to Morehead City. But from the very beginning on, in January, Sherman is pounding General Ennis Palmer, who commands the small body of Union forces up here in New Bern. All kinds of art requests for information. How many locomotives? How many boxcars? I mean, his theory, clearly he's not counting on Wilmington. He knows it's going to be Morehead City because they've controlled it since Burnside's 1862. If I wanted to talk a little bit about, sometimes as a leader, I think Sherman kind of turned a blind eye to a few things. Obviously, when we look at Sherman, you read all the accounts of the bummers and stuff. Of course, there was a general order that laid it out, that specified how it was supposed to happen. But of course, an army of 60,000 has any city of 60,000 is going to have a criminal element in it. Obviously, Sherman's army had a criminal element in it. But I love the example when he's coming through and he rides past this one bummer who's got, chickens in both hands and all kinds of food hanging around his neck. And Sherman's like, "What are you doing, soldier? What are you doing?" And the soldier doesn't recognize him because he doesn't look like a general. So he kind of fires back. Before you know it, "Do you know who I am?" And the guy, he goes, "Well, I'm Chaplain so-and-so from the 112th Massachusetts." 112th Massachusetts. I mean, that's a high regimental number there. So obviously the soldier's lying to Sherman to begin with, but Sherman kind of let him go on. So at times Sherman kind of had a look the other way. The boys are just kind of fired up, especially down in South Carolina. But when we get up here in North Carolina, you see a different. That's why when we go to Averysboro and Bentonville, you still see plantation houses that still stand. Okay, they weren't burnt to the ground. The Willis Cole farmhouse, plantation house was burned at Bentonville, but that's only because D.H. Hill ordered it burnt down. He's a Confederate. So at times, his discipline, his turning the other eye, I have a hard time as a military officer.
Thank you. Looking over the Civil War in North Carolina, in your opinion, did the Union err in not exploiting Burnside's successes in early 1862?
Yes. But the problem that was handicapping Burnside, it's okay when your operations are amphibious and the Navy's there to provide naval gunfire if you need to, Roanoke Island, New Bern, Fort Macon. And oh, by the way, you don't require a lot of cavalry. But the minute you move into the interior of the state, i.e. towards Goldsboro, where the Wilmington and Weldon and North Carolina Railroad began, there at Goldsboro, you're moving into the interior. And the problem with Burnside's force initially, didn't have any mounted force. We're still looking months away before the 3rd New York Cavalry arrives down here in eastern North Carolina. And that's when you see Foster's raid later on in December and stuff. But Burnside, yes, Goldsboro, Wilmington were viable options on the table. Even Raleigh was thrown out there when you read Sauer's book. But the problem is when you start looking at those kind of operations moving into specifically Goldsboro, Raleigh, and you don't have a mounted arm, which is the eyes and ears of the army, that makes it very difficult. And I think it's July, and Lincoln personally summons Burnside back up to Virginia. By that time, the events had taken a different turn around Richmond, and there's the campaigns up there. So obviously, Burnside is moved on. But yeah, can you imagine the Confederates losing Goldsboro early on, and how would supplies make it from that come in through the blockade at Wilmington? They have to work their way over towards Charlotte, then up towards Greensville to Danville, and all the way over back towards Petersburg and Richmond. Talk about a long route. So yeah, it could have had a serious impact because Wilmington, especially by 64, that is Lee's, I joke, that's Lee's IV bag in his left arm. I mean, that is his lifeline to the Army of Northern Virginia, is what's coming in there at the port of Wilmington and the blockade runners. When you look at all the munitions and classes, supply, uniforms, etc., shoes coming in, that is, like I say, so yeah, it could have made a difference, but I really, the lack of a mounted force really handicapped Burnside early on, immediately after the fall of Fort Macon in April.
For generations and generations, the Virginia cabal was able to hijack the war. All the great heroes of Lee's army were all Virginians. All of his corps commanders, his major leaders, other than James Longstreet, were Virginians. North Carolina got a little red burr about that and stuff. But I'm just wondering, stepping back, you're a Tar Heel. How valuable was North Carolina to the Confederate war effort? What specifically were the most important contributions in order of importance that they made?
Now, look at the number of regiments. Let's begin with the number of regiments. The vast majority of which serves in the Army in Northern Virginia, and the few that state there's a half a dozen or so out in the Army of Tennessee. But even during Burnside in 62, I want to say the regimental numbers are up to around 40 by that time. Burnside showed up in March of 62. And of those 40 some regiments, there's only barely a half a dozen down here in North Carolina. So yeah, from the manpower perspective, obviously, I've touched on Wilmington as the importance of Wilmington and the railroads there. It's not just the blockade runners coming in Wilmington, but Wilmington is also coming south from Virginia. If you go that route to Wilmington, then that links you into the railroads that take you down into South Carolina. So you have that rail network, which is very important there. But out west in the Piedmont, the Confederate Naval Laboratory at Charlotte, for example, very important. The Confederate Medical Department in Charlotte also had where medicines were made. A lot of experimental drugs going on because of the shortages and stuff, using natural, barks and beans and all kinds of stuff, whatever. But you had that medical laboratory going on, as well as at Lincolnton, you have the distillery. So there is a lot of importance here in North Carolina and what it contributed. And I'll tell you, yeah, my next project I'm working on right now is North Carolina's Confederate hospitals. North Carolina had the third largest number of hospitals, second only to Virginia and Georgia during the war. But this whole states' rights thing, when you got 300 Confederates laying in a Richmond hospital, Tar Heels that are wounded from Fredericksburg, but they're being treated by a surgeon from Maryland or from wherever, that really would when you read it, really causes a lot of angst. And down here in North Carolina, the very first medical director of hospitals here in North Carolina wasn't from North Carolina. He was from Maryland. The poor guy, Edward Napoleon Covey, only lasted 6 months because he ran into a guy by the name of General Whiting at Wilmington, who did not like a few policies he was kicking out. So I think after 6 months, he said adios. But the next guy that came in was Peter Hines, who was a Raleigh boy. Much different story. So yeah, I think contributions to North Carolina to war, absolutely. But the aspect of states' rights and the disparity of who's in charge of North Carolina soldiers, whether laying in a hospital or commanding them at a battlefield at Cold Harbor or at Gettysburg, was important too. And it's not just North Carolina; it's other states as well.
Sure. I'm gonna tempt my luck with you, Wade, and I'm gonna try to package two more questions in here and still finish around 9 o'clock. So whether I get two or not depends on your efficiency in answering the first one, and it's an open-ended one, so we'll see where you come with it. But tell me about Tar Heel leadership, both military and civilian, in the war. Give me a couple of winners and a couple of losers.
Tar Heel leadership. Obviously, from the civilians' perspective, I would say Zebulon Vance, our governor. did a fabulous job there. If I look at North Carolinian, let's just go with, and gang, I'm not beating a dead horse here. And I compliment Earl Hess for a great rewrite or restudy, analysis, relook, whatever we want to label it, of Braxton Bragg. But, Earl did a great job. But the one disappointment for me, when I got to 1865, the story didn't change. Wise's Fork, he captured an entire brigade on the first day. His forces did, but somehow or another he winds up losing that battle. He gives up the battlefield. And then we're going to talk about it on March 19th when we get to the tour. I briefly mentioned earlier how they stumbled into an ambush. The 14th Corps, Jeff Davis's boys, Morgan and Carlin. But Carlin ran off the battlefield. The Acorns just running down the road. But Jimmy Morgan's boys, south of the old Goldsboro Road, was able to dig in for a couple hours because a certain general did not move. And that general's name was Braxton Bragg. He was supposed to attack in concert with the Army of Tennessee. So if I go with my winner, it's Zebulon Vance from the civilian perspective, and a loser from the military perspective is Braxton Bragg. But then again, I don't buy all the old story, and I think Earl did a great job. But like I said, when he gets to 1865, he's not changed my opinion of Braxton Bragg.
Okay. Well, I've got to ask because I love Nicole Kidman. And so you knew this was coming. The movie Cold Mountain paints a harsh picture of the commitment of individuals and the population areas of North Carolina to the Confederate cause. Do you believe the movie fairly represented the areas of concern, or was it overstated?
My favorite part of the movie is when the young mother and the baby, and he's trying to make it back home, and he winds up going to this. I think she's a widow by this point, but she's got her husband daguerreotype up over the fireplace, and the Union foragers come by, and they attempt a sexual assault on her, and he winds up killing them. But I think that piece right there, your husband miles away, there's no internet, there's no phone, there's no email. You're out there in the middle of nowhere, rural North Carolina, and here comes about a half a dozen boys, Sherman's bummers, and they want to take all your food, and you're there with a young baby, and you're trying to make it through the winter, or at least make it through spring. You get the point. That part of the movie hit me the most, because the minute I saw it, I said, "Dang, that's how." Because everyone's house wasn't a plantation. Okay, most of it was rural. Sherman's march went through the rural part of the Carolinas, and that's the kind of home they probably passed. It could have been a mother and a couple daughters, and or in that particular case, I just think that part was very powerful to me.
Well, we've eaten up an hour, my friend. I really have appreciated your preparation for this program and all the support materials that you put forward with it. I think we're going to have a really great time in October. I look forward to it. I look to a good turn of folks. And for those of you who are interested in joining us, we'd certainly love to see you. And Wade, thank you so very much. It's a pleasure talking with you again. And I look forward to us getting together again real soon.
Yeah, Lynn, and real quick, folks, gang, if you had Bentonville and Aversboro on your bucket list 10 years ago, and you went to those places 10 years ago, this is an opportunity to come back. Honestly, there's been so much work between Civil War Trust and Bentonville is almost 90% of the battlefield on March 19th is now owned by the state preserve, with walking trails, interpretive panels. It's not the same Bentonville from 10 years ago. And plus, if you come along on this tour, we're gonna go off the beaten path to a couple other places down around Carolina stuff, and especially Monroe's Crossroads. Right now, Monroe's Crossroads is a green light. Right now, we're going to get on. We're going to wait till final word in September. But right now, things are looking good, folks. So, okay. Lynn, thanks a lot, guy. Karen, thank you, hon, for all your help. You helped me get me straight.
You are so welcome.
If anybody has got any questions, you can open up the mics. We'll sit here for about 5 or 10 minutes, and you can ask your questions directly of Wade. If not, we're going to be history if somebody doesn't speak in the next minute or two. Thanks a lot, and we'll hold on a few more minutes. So thank you.
Hey, Tim.
Wade, can you tell me how things have improved or changed over at Wise's Forks over the last 8 years? I was last there in 2012, I think.
Right now, if you were there in 2012, it's pretty much the same thing. I know the trust is working with the state and a few other folks. We're looking along Southwest Creek. When you visited there, did you see the trenches along Southwest Creek, the wonderful preserved trenches?
Yes.
Okay. Well, south of, those trenches run all the way out to the main highway there. Well, south of that road on the other side where Jackson's Mill was during the battle, that property is coming open right now. And the trust is working with the folks down there. So really no change in the interpretive panels and stuff like that. Obviously the CSS Noose. If you haven't been to see the new Noose and the new museum, wonderful, because you walk out and see the CSS Noose 2 right outside, which is a great comparison. The visitor center on Highway 70 where the monument and stuff was, well, that's kind of all been changed now, but I'm told that there's going to be a visitor. They're moving back into that visitor center and they're still going to be covering a little bit of the aspects of the Civil War. But right now, that's the only thing I can think off the back of my mind. The Cobb House, where Upham's brigade was captured, there's a Civil War Trails marker. There's that period house there. There's a rumor that that house may be up for sale. And some very historic-minded folks are looking at purchasing it. The other period home, if you would have went east towards New Bern, it sat off the road about a half a mile. Which is right where Hoke's attack was on March 10th. The Voss house, that was destroyed, unfortunately. That was just taken down, destroyed totally, which was a loss from the preservation side of the house. So few subtle changes, my friend, but not much. But hopefully with the things are moving in the right direction, there will be a little bit more.
Okay, thank you very much.
If you get down here, give me a holler. I'd love to meet you over there. I'll take you around the battlefield.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
Other questions and stuff. I see some folks still there. Anybody want to ask a question or pop in? I think Karen, tell them what they need to do to pitch in.
Well, I got a question, or not question, but it's good job, Wade. And I'll be heading up to Cheraw June 3rd, with some friends, just to check it out again. But how are you logistically, Len, going to do this tour? Where are you going to start them at? Where are they going to come into so they can get on the tour?
Well, we're going to operate up.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Wade. That's okay.
Yeah, Steve. Hey, good to hear from you again, my friend. I'm looking at Fayetteville. About an hour and a half jaunt from Fayetteville back down towards that direction, because ultimately I'm going to work my way back north. Hit Cheraw, then hit Chesterfield, then up towards Wadesboro, then obviously heading in the direction of Pinehurst, Southern Pines, where I'm picking up the movement of Kilpatrick's mounted his brigades. And that's going to end it. And we're right there near Fayetteville. And then we'll pick up Monroe's Crossroads the next morning. That's kind of how I'm looking at it like that. It's going to be a long day in the saddle, obviously. But I think the benefits of seeing some of these places that are normally off the beaten path, and then some of the property owners that's given me permission to go out there, I think will be, like I said, it's going to be a long day in the saddle, Steve, but I think it'd be worth it in the end.
Okay, good.
A question.
Yeah, go ahead, Maynard. Good to see you.
Yeah, been a while. The campaign that Pleasanton did out in what you called, I believe, the Piedmont area. I've never heard too much about those actions out there before. Is it because they had little influence on the rest of the battles that were going on in the center part, or just got lost in the haze of the end of the war?
We're talking
Are
about
you thinking of
Stoneman's raid in
Stoneman or?
1865. Yes, sir. I think Grant kind of sums it up. It happened so late. And really Chris Hartley's book. I mean, he really did the definitive study on it, kind of helped put it on the map. Now, when you venture out there to that part of the state, there's Civil War trails marker all over following Stoneman's raid.
We did Stoneman's a couple of years ago, Maynard. I led that tour, and a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun moving around in the Virginia Piedmont, and then also moving around. We got all the way down. We oriented out of the Winston-Salem area and got over as far as Greensboro, and followed Jefferson Davis's plight in the raid over against Reedy Creek Bridge, which is just to the north of Greensboro, and then got over to Henry Courthouse in Martinsville and stuff. So it's really is very fascinating, and I think it would have been a remarkable raid had it taken place a year earlier.
Thank you. Enjoyed the show.
Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else, folks? Speak now or forever hold your peace. Wade, thanks very much. Good to see you, and we'll be in touch. Thanks, Tim, Maynard, Emily, those folks. Emily, we'll be in touch with you and Jesse concerning your trip out to the Outer Banks. So drop me a text, and Wade, you and I will chat about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Offline.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially depending on what route you're going. You're on the ferry and stuff. Please, I work for the ferry, so please let me know. It can be challenging this time of year. It's very busy right now. So, okay, thanks.
Good enough. Good night, folks.